Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. In this episode I'm going to cover the tale of two DC madams. Now I'm going to take you back in time a little bit to 2008 to refresh your memory about the DC madam, Deborah Jean Palfrey. Almost everyone recalls the DC madam case because it supposedly involved a number of high-powered figures in Washington, D.C., although none of the names ever actually came out. Everything was sealed under court order. What you will notice about this case is how you have some of the same figures appear again and again that we're dealing with today related to the Epstein scenario. You're going to find ABC News, the Washington Post, and the CIA appearing over and over and over. If you followed my show for a while, you will notice that several of these figures have appeared in the past and will come up again in future episodes. It's almost as if there is some kind of connection at these high levels of power between the CIA and the news organizations. Not that that should be any surprise to anyone with two brain cells to rub together. Now, the DC madam, Deborah Palfrey, was facing trial for running the largest escort service in Washington, D.C. at the time. She supposedly committed suicide on May 1st of all days in 2008, despite the fact that on many an occasion before she said that she would never commit suicide. And it's really quite frightening and amazing how many times you see suicidality appear in these cases. We have it going all the way back to the famed McMartin trial, where you had the police officer Paul Bynum who was going to testify at the trial, and he supposedly committed suicide. You can move from there to the Franklin cover-up, where there were a number of also suicides and accidents with guns and other kinds of accidents and other possible murders. But again, we are all expected to just stay asleep on these matters and never make any connections between them and never ask any serious questions. Because simply to raise questions about things is to be deemed a conspiracy theorist by the mainstream media. In 2016, according to Palfrey's attorney, he later came out and said that the records from the court needed to be unsealed because they could have made an impact on the 2016 presidential race. Apparently, persons involved, as Republicans or Democrats, were somehow tied up in her escort and prostitution service. Here I'm going to read a short portion from an article from Who, What, Why, titled, "Will DC Madam's Infamous Little Black Book Emerge?" It begins, "Yes, madam, call us crazy, but we do think it's a little strange when a person ends up dead exactly the way they said would never happen, especially if that person was in possession of documents that could topple the careers of hundreds of powerful people. Her death was 2 election cycles ago, but now her little black book is in the news again, which is all to the good in our opinion. Any attention to her rather suspicious death is more than welcome. Palfrey's lawyer, Montgomery Blair Sibley, a character in his own right, is asking to have a previous gag order lifted so he can release the names in the little black book. He says that it will throw the presidential election out of orbit." He goes on to point out here that there were more than 800 clients listed in her company's little black book. Prior to trial, she was quoted as saying, "I'm planning on going into court and defending myself vigorously and exposing the government." And that was her big mistake, that she was going to name names. According to another article that I have here, a number of the entities involved who had been procuring the services of the DC madam were the following: Department of Health and Human Services, FBI, General Services Administration, U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, the IRS, the National Drug Intelligence Center, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Army Information Systems Command, Department of Commerce, Department of State, U.S. Postal Service, and the U.S. Forest Service, the Archdiocese of Washington, Embassy of Japan, Bethlehem Steel, Constellation Energy, Hewlett-Packard, Johns Hopkins University, Washington Gas, and several local law firms. So I'll go ahead and take a look at this article real quick just so you can get a taste of what was going on. This is from Vice. New details on the infamous DC Madam scandal emerge, revisiting one of the biggest scandals to rock Washington, D.C. This is from 2017. A decade ago, one of the biggest scandals to rock Washington, D.C. was the revelation that some prominent lawmakers and government officials had allegedly been customers of Pamela Martin and Associates, an escort service operated by Deborah Jean Palfrey, a woman better known as the D.C. Madam. In October of 2006, following a 2-year investigation conducted by the U.S. Postal Inspection Service and the IRS, federal agents raided Palfrey's Vallejo, California home and froze her bank accounts. The government, which secured an indictment against Palfrey on money laundering, illegal mail use, and prostitution-related racketeering charges, alleged that Palfrey's D.C. escort service was in fact a high-end prostitution ring that she had operated via phone and email from Northern California since 1993. Palfrey, however, insisted Pamela Martin and Associates provided legal, high-end erotic fantasy service and that she had no idea her escorts had sex with customers. In March 2007, after she was charged, she turned over a list of nearly 10,000 phone records spanning 4 years to ABC News. Palfrey said she didn't know the names of her clients, she only had their telephone numbers. For days leading up to ABC's exclusive interview with Palfrey, investigative reporter Brian Ross teased that Palfrey's clientele included White House officials, lobbyists, and Pentagon, FBI, and IRS employees, as well as prominent lawyers. There are thousands of names, tens of thousands of phone numbers. But, and here we go with the crucial part, ABC backed away from naming names, and Palfrey accused the network of bowing to government pressure by withholding them. In the end, the network only revealed a few of the most prominent officials on Palfrey's client list, including Republican Senator David Vitter, Deputy Secretary of State Randall Tobias, who resigned when details of his use of escort surfaced, and an advisor to the Pentagon. So I'm going to move from there to introduce you to an individual known as the first D.C. Madam. That would be Henry W. Vinson, who wrote this book, Confessions of a D.C. Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail. And this is a must-read book. It was published in 2014. And this is just a reminder here as to why ABC News is important in this connection, because ABC News had lots of information about Epstein and decided to bury the story. And this was revealed by a whistleblower to Project Veritas. There is an exclusive interview with Henry Vinson, the only one that I am aware of, and it was done by Ed Opperman, a private investigator of the Opperman Report, and you can get that here at his website, which I'll link below. The book has been well reviewed, and it is loaded with a number of very interesting bombshells, some of which I will read to you from the book right now. This is from Chapter 1, titled Deja Vu, beginning on page 8. I had been on the treadmill for about 10 minutes, listlessly peering upwards at the television when the expression, D.C. Madam, sliced through the air. The words jolted me as if they were fired from a stun gun, and I felt momentary paralysis. I was nearly hurled from the treadmill, but I had the wherewithal to leap off the track while I became transfixed on the television. CNN was reporting on the case of Deborah Jean Palfrey, who ran a Washington, D.C.-based escort service. The media had branded her as the D.C. Madam. CNN flashed a picture of Miss Palfrey. She had shoulder-length brunette hair, benign bronze eyes, and a porcelain complexion. She had the appearance of a stylish librarian or high school English teacher, even though the government accused her of being a racketeer. The media had branded me a D.C. Madam years before Deborah Jean Palfrey was given that distinction. Although the media's reportage on me has been distorted and derisive, it's indeed accurate that at the sprite age of 29, I was the proprietor of the largest gay escort service in Washington, D.C. The Washington Post's skewed coverage of me was due to the fact that the newspaper, by either commission or omission, took its cue from the federal government, which manufactured a labyrinth of lies about my circumstances. And I think none of us would find any of that surprising at all, especially since so many of them are tied up with all of these escort services. The federal government also unleashed a reign of terror on my family and me. In fact, the feds even threatened to indict my elderly mother, and one newspaper reported that Secret Service agents actually kicked down the front door of my sister's home and held my brother-in-law at gunpoint. The feds felt it was imperative to ensure my silence by any means necessary, because I had witnessed events that invariably would have ignited seismic political cataclysms that had the potential to jeopardize the administration of George H.W. Bush and the subsequent Bush dynasty. Given my former incarnation as a D.C. madam, I followed the tribulations, trial, and death of Deborah Jean Palfrey with intense interest. I marveled at the striking similarities between our cases, and I empathized with her dire circumstances. On Larry King Live, Miss Palfrey dispensed a warning to Americans about their corrupt political system. Think about it a bit, and you'll come to the conclusion that we have come to, that there are possible people who have used the service who have become the subjects and targets of blackmail. I'm uncertain if Miss Palfrey witnessed the blackmailing of politicians firsthand, but I was certainly privy to the blackmailing of politicians and sundry power brokers. If the Department of Justice, the Secret Service, and the Washington Post had not been fixated on covering up the facts and individuals enmeshed in my case, Americans would have learned the unsavory truth that blackmail is endemic to their political system. The sexual escapades of the D.C. elite are vastly different than the infidelities of the average citizen, thus their susceptibility to blackmail. Before Miss Palfrey's trial, she imparted flurries of sound bites to the media intimating that she was the custodian of too many secrets, and the government would be unlocking a Pandora's box if it prosecuted her. Quote, I am sure as heck not going to be going to a federal prison for one day, let alone, 4 to 8 years here, because I'm shy about bringing in the deputy secretary of whatever, Palfrey told ABC. Not for a second. I'll bring every last one of them in if necessary. I, like Miss Palfrey, thought that the secrets I had amassed over the years would discourage the government from prosecuting me. After the Secret Service's initial raid and ransacking of my home and prior to being indicted, I remarked to a reporter, quote, somebody set us up because they were scared about what we knew about high government officials. And anyways, if they try to indict me, I'll have some good stories to tell, end quote. I was a mere 29 years old when I dispensed that quote, and, regrettably, I had the aplomb and inexperience of youth, which is an extremely flawed tandem when locking horns with the federal government. I woefully underestimated the ruthlessness and absolute power of my adversary. Miss Palfrey followed through on her threat and attempted to unfurl her secrets. She presented ABC News with 43 pounds of printed pages that contained the phone numbers of the thousands of Johns who frequented her escort service over the years. Miss Palfrey had no idea of the names accompanying the vast majority of the phone numbers, and she hoped that ABC would decipher that information. She felt that the potentially pyrokinetic scoop she handed to ABC would force the government on the defensive and impede its zealous crusade to imprison her. Now, I did a loose back-of-the-napkin calculation on this and figured out that 43 pounds of these printed pages should have come out to almost 6,000 pages of material that she gave ABC. But her counteroffensive spectacularly backfired. ABC refused to follow through on the revelations contained in the 43-pound printouts. ABC correspondent Brian Ross announced that, based on our reporting, it turned out not to be as newsworthy as we thought in terms of names. These people are such liars. Even though it would emerge that Palfrey's patrons included, for starters, a U.S. senator, a Department of Defense consultant who developed the shock and awe doctrine deployed in Iraq, and State Department official Randall Tobias. In a stunning demonstration of hypocrisy, Tobias was the Agency for International Development's Director of Foreign Assistance, and he managed agencies that required the foreign recipients of AIDS assistance to condemn prostitution. Go figure. The federal government subjected both Miss Palfrey and me to crucible. The federal government subjected both Miss Palfrey and me to crucible that was designed to ensure our silence or ultimately crush us. Quote, they just destroy you on every level, financially, emotionally, psychologically, Miss Palfrey reportedly said of federal prosecutors. In the case of Miss Palfrey, the U.S. Attorney for the District of D.C. smacked her with a 14-count RICO indictment that included money laundering, racketeering, and using the mail for illegal purposes in connection with a prostitution ring, and she was facing a bewildering 55 years behind bars. I, too, was merely running an escort service, but the U.S. Attorney for the District of D.C. walloped me with a 43-count RICO indictment. I was potentially staring at 295 years behind bars. I was also looking at the possibility of a $2 million fine, and as I previously mentioned, the feds were threatening to indict my mother. Although my case and Miss Palfrey share numerous parallels, a major point of divergence is the proficiency of our respective attorneys. D.C.-based attorney Montgomery Sibley represented Miss Palfrey, and Greta Van Susteren represented me. Mr. Sibley vigorously defended Miss Palfrey, but he had to contend with the Fed's judicial chicanery and sleight of hand. Miss Palfrey's initial trial judge had authorized Mr. Sibley's subpoenas of the White House, State Department, CIA, and so on, and he also authorized the subpoenas for AT&T Mobility, Sprint and Nextel, and T-Mobile USA and Alltel, which would have mandated those carriers to provide Ms. Palfrey with the names and addresses of the individuals who contacted her escort service. Inexplicably, Ms. Palfrey's initial trial judge was replaced by a judge who quashed Ms. Sibley's subpoenas en masse and thereby eviscerated the defense's case. And this is, of course, what happens in all of these cases. It's just so predictable. They'll judge hop until they get the right judge in there that they want. At the outset of my case, my attorney, Greta Van Susteren, seemed very committed to a vigorous defense on my behalf, and she deployed a nearly identical tactic as Miss Sibley. She filed an 11-page motion to mandate the release of my clientele list that the government had previously seized from me. Miss Van Susteren argued that the names of my patrons would be released because if the government's assertion was accurate and my, quote, escort service was, in actuality, a prostitution ring, my clients aided and abetted a criminal enterprise. But the assistant U.S. attorney for D.C. vehemently contested Miss Van Susteren's motion with a remarkably disingenuous argument. He contended that the names of my patrons shouldn't be made public because the U.S. Attorney's Office feared the intimidation of government witnesses due to the embarrassing nature of the case. My trial judge sided with the prosecution and barred the public disclosure of my clientele. After my trial judge acquiesced to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Ms. Van Susteren started to change her tune, and she urged me to take the government's plea bargain. And this, again, is a very typical thing. The feds will come at you with a huge number of charges. You'll be facing dozens upon dozens, perhaps even hundreds of years, as in these cases, and they just want you to take the plea deal so that you'll be silent and you'll go away. By then, my family and I had been subjected to a relentless campaign of terror, and I faced life in prison. I felt as if the feds were wielding the sword of Damocles over my head. At Miss Van Susteren's behest, I accepted the government's plea bargain, and I was sentenced to 63 months in federal prison. The feds also included a caveat that wasn't overtly stated in my plea agreement. My 5-year sentence was based on the contingency that I not divulge a word about the particulars of my case to the media. Although I'm uncertain whether or not it's a mere coincidence, I should point out that the individuals who were instrumental in the cover-up of my case experienced significant upward mobility. And then he goes on to list all these people who benefited, it seems, after he was thrown away in prison. After I was gagged and banished to a federal prison, I've been told that the government sealed in perpetuity a myriad of documents in my case. I'm aware of at least 3 individuals who have attempted to unseal my documentation, but the government has successfully rebuffed each of them. And we see that this is ongoing, of course, in the other D.C. Madam's case as well. Conversely, Ms. Palfrey opted to fight City Hall, but the U.S. Attorney for D.C. triumphed in her case, and she was found guilty on all counts. As Ms. Palfrey awaited sentencing, she purportedly committed suicide. Ms. Palfrey's death is mired in conjecture, rumor, and innuendo, and the internet is rife with speculation that Ms. Palfrey's suicide was indeed a murder. Gee, one wonders why. Ms. Palfrey publicly stated on a handful of occasions that she would never commit suicide.
What exactly do you think happened to the D.C. Madam? Do you think she committed suicide?
She told me on air she would never commit suicide, and then she told me off air. I pressed her off air during the breaks, and I talked to her a few times, also not just on the radio, but at her home over the phone. And she said, that's ridiculous. I'll never kill myself. I am being followed. You know, they might try to kill me. Then I talked to Wayne Madsen, who's an investigative journal in D.C., and I've talked to 2 of her lawyers. And on record, she said, if I'm killed, I want an investigation. If they say it's suicide, it's murder. So we have her lawyers. We have another investigative journalist that met with her at dinner with the lawyers as a witness to this. And then we have, all these other people she talked to, like the manager of the condominiums where she lived in Florida. She said, okay, I'm going to pay you for 6 months. I'm going to send you another check. I'm going to be in about 5 to 6 years. I'm going to be out. God is going to put pressure on my mother, but I'm going to go visit her before I have to go into jail and leave some papers there for safekeeping. And then she hung herself in her mother's shed, which would totally freak her mother out. And everybody that knew her, she was really ladylike and really into her etiquette. I mean, she would never do that to her mother. And I advised her on air and off. I said, listen, you need to go ahead and release all this now. And I said, and don't tell anybody you're going to release it. Just come on the air and do it with somebody, or they're going to kill you.
Moreover, after Ms. Palfrey's demise, an Orlando affiliate of CBS interviewed the building manager of the Park Lake Towers in Orlando, where Ms. Palfrey owned a condo. The building manager disclosed that he had talked to Ms. Palfrey just 3 days before her lifeless body was found in her mother's aluminum shed. Quote, Jean Palfrey was a class act, said the building manager. Her way out of this world certainly would not have been in an aluminum shed attached to a mobile home in Tarpon Springs, Florida. The manager also discussed a disturbing conversation he had with Miss Palfrey. She insinuated that there is a contract out for her, and I fully believe that they succeeded. The Washington Post was quick to declare that Palfrey had taken her own life, despite the possibility of indications to the contrary. I mention the latter point because the Washington Post reported a myriad of details about my case that were inaccurate, despite the possibility of indications to the contrary, or solely based on the word of federal law enforcement officials. Although I'm unwilling to speculate whether or not the death of Miss Palfrey was a suicide or a murder, I feared for my life when I was a D.C. madam due to the threats discharged by government officials and also by individuals who were reportedly affiliated with the government. As Miss Palfrey and I regrettably discovered, Americans have a collective naivete about D.C. sex scandals, believing that they are the mere dalliances and moral failings of a handful of individuals. Americans have great difficulty accepting that many of our politicians are endowed with a potent alchemy of power, arrogance, and lust, an alchemy that fluently translates into extramarital affairs or illicit sexual encounters. Unfortunately, the federal government has a greater dexterity to cover up scandals and crimes that lend themselves to blackmail in D.C. due to the fact that the capital's law enforcement is exclusively controlled by various branches of the federal government. The U.S. Attorney for D.C., who prosecutes all D.C. crimes, is appointed by the President. The FBI and Secret Service are also minions of the executive branch, and Congress controls the budgets of D.C.'s Metropolitan Police Department. And I just thought this would be an interesting way to introduce you to this book, to Henry Vinson, and suggest that you buy the book. I will link that below. But in part 2 of this, I'm going to draw connections between this and the Franklin cover-up and get into some truly bombshell information that I can't believe other people don't seem to have covered very much in the past. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.